Who here has ever typed brew install into their terminal? Hands up. I find this remarkable because when I initially wrote the code, the first time I typed brew install, it crashed. Today I'm going to tell you the story of how Homebrew came to be. And because this is a tech conference, I have to do something a bit techy with it, so I've also divided it into 8 steps for making successful open source. What's the first step? Any guesses? Shout it out. Idea? No. The first step is the same as the first step for almost everything. It's the pub. About 9 years ago, I was in the pub talking with my work colleagues. At the time, we made software which ran on Windows, on Mac, on Linux, on Android, on iOS, and even on BlackBerry, if you can believe it. We had a lot of different code bases, but we were trying to consolidate all the different dependencies we had. In order to do this, we used the package manager of the time on Mac. We used Mac because that's where all the SDKs, all the IDEs, they all worked on Mac for all the different platforms, and we could cross-compile to Linux and Windows. So we used Mac ports. Mac ports is a very fine thing. It's still great, but it wasn't quite what we needed. And in fact, that's really what step 1 is. Step 1 is to identify a need. You have to have something you need to scratch, something you need for your work. So I said to everybody at the pub, I was like, well, how hard can it be to make your own package manager? And so everyone laughed, because that's the kind of stupid question people ask at the pub. And I said, okay, Max, why don't you make your own Max ports? We laughed again, but I went home and I started step 2. Step 2 is to write the code. I think it says a lot about open source software that only 1 of 8 of steps is actually programming. So I started writing a bunch of Ruby scripts. I chose Ruby because it seemed cool, and it is cool, but I have to say Swift is cooler. But we didn't have Swift 9 years ago. I wrote what I needed, and I made it work with the work I was doing. And I started to build new ideas and come up with new concepts. I started to get excited about what I was building. So I put it onto GitHub, and it stayed just me using it for months. Because it turns out, the step 3 is to tell people about it. If you don't tell anyone about your open source software, I assure you nobody's going to find it. It will just stay you. So, as it turned out, one day on Twitter, someone I followed posted a question to superuser.com. The question was, how can I... Don't read that. The question was, how can I configure and compile, build my own software on Mac, keep all the dependencies up to date, and make sure that it's kept up to date? So I was like, well, I'm actually an expert on this right now. I've been an expert for quite a while. I've been building this product for 4 or 5 months, and I've been building software like Linux and all these other different platforms for years. So I answered it thoroughly, and I answered it expertly, and at the end I plugged Homebrew. I said, well, if you like all the ideas I've been saying in this post, I've built a tool that can do it for you. How about that? And then the first few users started to trickle in. You got a few users, you've been featured on iOS Dev Weekly with your new iOS framework, but that isn't the end. There's 5 more steps. The next step is growing your product. This is the hardest step. iOS Dev Weekly features your framework, and suddenly you have 2,000 users and 100 bug tickets opened, people demanding your time, saying, I want this feature's the most essential, give me that, give me this. And you didn't really expect anyone to use it. With Homebrew, I knew very soon after I put it up that I'd need to grow Homebrew really fast. This quote from the founder of Wikipedia, Jimmy Wales, kept coming to mind. I couldn't build an encyclopedia by myself. I knew I couldn't build the entire package database for Homebrew by myself. Mac ports at the time had 2,500 packages. I'd done maybe 7 or 8 for Homebrew, and I was already bored. I knew I would have to make it as easy as possible for other people to contribute in order for Homebrew to be a success. I have here a video showing the growth of Homebrew. That's me whizzing around making the first few commits. Soon I'll tell people about it and other people turn up, there you are. And then they break the first rule of Homebrew Club and tell other people, and boom. That was Hacker News. I've never read Hacker News, I still don't, but it was very useful in this case. Enormous contribution. In case it isn't obvious, this is unprecedented. I don't think there's ever been another open source project which has this much contribution. So what did I do right? Well, firstly, I had a great README. The README got to the point of why you would want to use Homebrew, why it was better than the competition. It told you how to use the tool in the README. How many READMEs have you read where it doesn't even say how to use the tool? Or if it's a framework, it doesn't tell you what the import is. That you're meant to compile it yourself and look in the derived data folder to find out what the module name is. And I also, in the second paragraph, told people how to contribute. I made a trivial installation method. Now, over time, this has led to people saying I did a bad thing because it's a single line of code, you copy and paste off the internet into your terminal, and then it runs a script that it downloads. I'm encouraging insecure behavior, but I have no regrets because I feel that this trivial installation process was part of the reason for Homebrew's success. You have to have as little friction as possible when people are trying out new things. At the time, Mac Ports was very popular. Like, why on earth would I compete with Mac Ports? It was nuts. In order to compete, I had to make something that people could just use without doing too much work. And Homebrew didn't have any dependencies. You can install it on a fresh Mac without having to do anything else apart from my installation script. Easy as possible. If it wasn't as easy as possible, people just would have skipped it and gone to the next link on Hacker News. I had compelling advantages over Mac Ports. Mac Ports would take an hour to compile and build wget, a simple downloading tool. That's because it rebuilt the world. It rebuilt everything all the way up to libc, and that takes a long time. This didn't really make a lot of sense to me because the Mac comes with all these dependencies built in. So I just made it so it used all the dependencies the Mac came with, and it takes 3 minutes to build wget, and it doesn't even take that anymore because of the bottling system. These long compile times were a big issue with using Mac ports. Also, it wasn't very hackable, but I'll get to that in a minute. I had a great developer experience for Homebrew, and I think this is something that is often overlooked with people who make open source software. People who come to your open source, they read the README, what do they do next? They don't know how to get involved. With Homebrew, I made it so that you could create new formula, the first step to contribution, straight with the tool, Brew create. Type in a URL, it would open up generated formula in your editor of choice, preferably TextMate. It would have loads of comments telling you what you should be doing next, how to proceed. And then Homebrew was built on top of Git, so you could just commit and push, and I could merge straight away. You were using tools you already knew how to use. You didn't have to learn a bunch of new stuff. Went straight to GitHub, a very great tool, which was relatively new at the time, for collaborating on making code together. And the formula were written in Ruby, a real programming language. You weren't having to use awful bash scripting or like some sort of markdown or some sort of other declarative syntax language. It was something nice that you could actually do anything you wanted with. Now, a lot of people thought this would be dangerous, but with hindsight, it really wasn't. The tool itself had a great user experience. I was fed up with, at the time, with tools that you would type stuff in and you didn't know what was going on. I'm a developer. I like to know what's going on with my computer. I want to know what the thing you've built is doing to it. So I output as much information as I could, but not too much. You have to have a good signal-to-noise ratio. Again, otherwise you're making a worse user experience. But then if things went wrong, I would output as much as possible, dumping huge amounts of information, so you had all the information you needed in order to try and fix the problem yourself. This is something I really wanted because I didn't really want to have to fix the problem for you. It would also search GitHub and try to find tickets already there for the same issue you were having. So you could go there and then work with other people to try and solve the problem, or if you didn't know how, you could at least just watch the ticket and then find out when the problem was fixed. I wanted Homebrew to be really nice because it's the only tool I would want to use. Homebrew was very hackable. That was the main itch I was trying to fix in the first place. I wanted to be able to have multiple installations of Homebrew installed, wanted to be able to edit the package information myself for each one of them. And because Homebrew was built on Git, if you did edit one of the formula, you could commit, and then whenever you did a brew update, all it did was a Git pull, so your changes would be merged with upstream. This still works, incidentally. I'm not sure if everybody knows about these kinds of features, but the people who did notice these kinds of features were the power users. These people have 20,000, 30,000 followers on Twitter. When they like something, they tweet about it, and then you have this huge viral marketing, which is what you were seeing just then. Finally, I was responsive on GitHub. If someone would post a ticket or a new formula, I'd try to get back to them as soon as possible. If I couldn't, I'd say, well, I see you've given me this contribution, I really appreciate that, and that's how I genuinely always felt. A lot of people act as though open source, you're giving your time away for free, so you should not be very nice about it. But I always felt like they had decided to commit to my product, and I was honored by that, so I treated them accordingly. And when you make people feel like their contribution or even their bug ticket is appreciated, they love your product and they tell people about it, and they're more readily likely to contribute or report bugs in the future. Incidentally, I recently built this tool called Canopy, which is for push notifications for GitHub. This is something I've wanted for 10 years, which is why I finally built it myself rather than wait for GitHub to do nothing. It changes the way you use GitHub for me. It makes it less like email and more like instant messaging. You can collaborate in real time on the work you're doing. It's for Mac and iOS, and they built it entirely in Swift, including the server-side component, which seems to be a theme today, which was hugely fun. I do recommend the server-side Swift route, just like the previous two speakers. If you want it, Canopy Codebase, just Google that. Step 5. So you've grown your product somewhat. This is a few months in. The next thing you should be doing is cultivating your community. The community is essential for any long-term open source project to survive. You are going to run out of steam, and the community will step in and take over. Initially, the community is vital because you're going to be completely burned out. If your project is successful at all, you're going to be getting tons and tons of contribution, questions, bug reports, things that you will want to deal with. For the first 3 months of Homebrew, I was doing 18-hour days with a full-time job, and thank God I was only 20-something because I couldn't do that anymore. But after 3 months, people started to become more involved in the project. They'd start with a few formula contributions, and then they would be interested in getting more involved. And to facilitate that, I wrote a lot of documentation. I had not only documentation about how Homebrew worked, but I also had like a guide for new contributors. It was full of the reasons for Homebrew's existence, the ethos, the philosophy, the way we wanted to emphasize simplicity and pragmatism over idealism. This is the stuff they were looking for, because they wanted to understand the project. At this point, you're the only person who understands your project. You spent 6 months working on it, sleepless nights, pondering how it should work, rejecting ideas, thinking up new ones. Nobody else has this information in their heads. You want, though, lots of people to have this information in their heads. They really won't unless you have a welcoming way for them to become part of the community. Homebrew also was easy to understand, at least at first. The sources were well organized. So you could look at the GitHub tree and you'd see what you were expecting to see based on how Homebrew worked just from your experience as a user. This is very important. You want your contributors to not give up. Like, learning new tools and libraries is hard work. You have to put the effort in to make sure that they're not doing hard work and they're not going to give up halfway through. You need them to persevere. And they're probably people who really love your product, or they wouldn't be this far. As I say, they contributed to a few formula and then they wanted to get involved, and I gave them the documentation to facilitate that. And made the sources sensibly arranged, well named. Names are so important, and thus I get to the naming scheme of Homebrew itself. And obviously the name was partly because we came up with it in the pub. It was the first suggestion. But I liked Homebrew as a name also because it implied the thing about the product that I cared about the most, that you could get inside it, hack it, and make it work the way you wanted to. Just as though if you were homebrewing your own beer, you could modify like how that lager tastes a little bit, and then it's yours. Then the brewing theme came out of that, and I wanted a theme from the very beginning so that people looking over the sources, looking over the system, understanding the system, had like readily available metaphors that they could then understand which bits do what. A keg stores beer, but in Homebrew, the package manager, a keg stores software. Kegs are stored in the cellar. Therefore, you know that the cellar directory probably contains software, like, which is the kegs. It's just a range of metaphors that allow people to quickly understand these new and often intimidating systems, so they can get involved more quickly, but also so the users know what's going on. Other package managers at the time would use, they didn't even have words for what a keg is. They'd say the directory that software is installed in or whatever, and like it just didn't facilitate learning the system. Or bug reporting, which I think is another important thing. You want people to be able to report bugs and know what words to use so everybody's on the same page. Otherwise you end up with lots of waffle. Nobody's really sure what files or directories anybody's talking about. Use good names. Don't go overboard. I think a lot of people nowadays go overboard, partly my fault, I think. Like was the first popular project of this kind with a silly naming scheme. With hindsight, maybe I wouldn't have used the beer theme. Like, honestly, when I was building this thing, I thought like maybe 4 people would use it. I didn't realize it would become this global phenomenon. But, well, I really like the name, so actually, no regrets. So with the Homebrew community, people would contribute through formula and then very quickly become core maintainers. We have 30 or so right now, I believe. Step 6 is what you'll be doing at the same time as steps 4 and 5, actually, which is to lead. Especially at the beginning of a project, like I was saying before, you're the only person who understands the project. You're the only person with all that information in your head, and you need to help people to see where you're going with that. When they suggest a new feature, if it doesn't fit, say no. Saying no a lot at the beginning is very important. If you say yes too many times, just because you don't want to be that bad person who says no to someone who has contributed a feature or at least an idea, your software will suck. Especially at the beginning. It's very important to like let your ideas flow until you really understand what it is you've been trying to build. Then you can come back and reconsider some of those features. So say no nicely, but explain why you're saying no as well. And if you find you can't really explain it that well, then maybe you're wrong. Being able to change your mind in any development is extremely important. You are not the best developer in the world, I am sorry. Probably other people have some good ideas. After the growth phase, you still need a leader, but you should probably rename yourself to lead maintainer, because you have a community at this point, and the community is the project, it's no longer yours. So you need to mitigate disputes, that's your purpose. So when people can't decide how something should be done, you're the final say, and that's just how it is. Like, you give it time, but if it can't be worked out, someone has to make that final decision. Otherwise, nothing will be done. Analysis paralysis, another typical time when you'll need to step in and just make a final decision and hope you make the right one. Step 7. Step 7 is years later. You've grown and you've maintained this community, and now you're no longer needed. And in fact, you're not even really interested anymore. For me, this happened about 3 or 4 years into Homebrew. I'd worked on it a lot, on and off, depending on commitments and work commitments. It comes much more easily when you have a great community, people who really understand your product. Then you don't really even need to be there. And I found that I didn't need to be there. And I was participating less and less. Eventually, the other maintainers asked me to transfer Homebrew off of my username onto the Homebrew organization. This was 3 or 4 years in, and Homebrew was still under my personal username, mxcl/homebrew, and I really liked that. I didn't want to to give it up. Whenever you went to the GitHub top repos, there was Homebrew right at the top. Most forks, most stars, most watches. MXCL made that, by the way. I was at a Christmas party in Chicago when I had this screen open on my laptop, and I showed it to my manager at the time, and I told him I couldn't push the button. And he said, well, really, Max, I don't think you should push the button. But I knew I had to. The project was no longer mine, and in fact, I wasn't really involved. So I needed to make the final gesture, move the project off of me, give it to the community, give it to everybody. So I pushed the button. I tried not to shed a tear. So what's step 8 after you've stepped down? Well, step 8 is whatever you want it to be. For me, apparently, it's getting free trips to Paris. I want you all to get to step 8, though. So you need to start at step 1. Identify that itch. Go home after the conference. Open up your code base and look for that bit of code you wrote. While you were writing it, you were thinking, why am I writing this? Why has someone else not made this open source library, tool, package already? Why did I have to write this? You've written the code, so take it out, encapsulate it, refactor it a little, use good names. The hardest thing for people using library frameworks that they've been recommended is understanding what each part does. Names are the best way to communicate intent in programming. Make it modular, make it hackable, put it on GitHub. Then follow steps 2 through 8. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's move to the other way of the other side of the scene. What I really like about Homebrew is also it's joyful. It's joyful to use. Like every time I want to install something, I said, "Oh, great! I need to launch Brew," and it's really like so easy and like you never have I don't know problems you had with the Macports or other stuff. And it really gives a feeling of I don't know, joy, really. So I really want to thank you for that. I was really wondering if you were suspecting that all that you were building would be that important for the success. You are talking, for example, about your kind of, I would say, laziness, the fact that you didn't want to solve people's problem, but give a way to people to actually solve themselves their problem. Did you think that it would be the most important key to success?
Yeah, from the beginning, I realized that I could not build the whole thing, and I didn't want to. So in making sure that other people could help themselves and also make the formula they needed was key. And in terms of reliability and it just works, so that was always at the back of my mind as well. I did a lot of things to make sure of that. Part of the reason Macports broke so often was the huge dependency graph. Huge dependency graphs with package management solutions. You just look at any node system, 600 packages is always problems. So you reduce that number of dependencies. Then Apple were doing a lot of the work that otherwise we would have had to do. They have a paid team who make sure the base dependencies on macOS work and continue working into the future. They can't change any of that stuff, or they break potentially software that's out there and being sold.
Yeah, and also the fact that whenever it breaks, you actually have some kind of helpers, sometimes of message that will actually tell you what to do. That's also really, really interesting, and you don't see that much often.
Yeah, I learned this when I was doing open source on Linux years ago. On Linux, everything's compiled from source, and 99% of the bug reports we got were the compile failed for some reason. So I started putting in snippets that would print out when it failed, usually during the configure script phase, that just gave them links to stuff that they could then figure out what to do themselves, rather than coming to our IRC channel and getting in our way when we're trying to get on with stuff. I believe the best programmers are lazy programmers. That's why we do computers, right? We want the computer to do all the work.
Things instead of us,
So I was getting the computer to help the user to then not
Yeah, and
progress.
bridging the gap. Like instead of having to look for documentation, you have it like right away. It's really nice idea. And
Yeah.
Yeah.
You told us that you had a strong philosophy around how Brew should work and should be maintained. Do you have like any clashes with top contributors with on Homebrew in case of differing philosophy? Like
Well, inevitably. So that's why it's so important you have to explain yourself well. If you can't explain yourself well, like I said, then maybe you aren't right. Maybe you don't understand the problem as well. And also, it's all about tone. The internet is obviously the worst place to do anything.
yeah.
So you just have to make sure you always sound nice. And I really didn't succeed at that. I was very stressed for quite a big portion of the beginning of Homebrew, but I couldn't stop. I felt like I'd built this thing and people wanted it, and I had to finish it. And so, yeah.
So it became more of a stressful thing than a joyful thing for you?
Yeah, definitely. I wouldn't recommend making a globally successful product by yourself.
No, but that's interesting and a bit sad, because what you said is also that you created some ways to actually help people, but even with that, you had to spend a lot of time.
I'm talking about the first few months, really. Like once the community started to develop, it took a lot of the burden off me, so I could concentrate on finishing it. When I first put Homebrew up, it couldn't even do dependency resolution, one of the fundamental things a package manager must do. Yet still, people were contributing like crazy. Partly the reason I got away with that is because we didn't rebuild the world like Mac ports did. So a lot of software didn't have any dependencies, at least to start with.
And when you actually had some contributors that were proposing some packages, did they often move to helping on the core or on the different features?
Often enough. As I said, I had all that infrastructure in place to help them migrate from that initial contribution to being more involved if they wanted to. And a lot of people did, because they did that initial contribution. They were like, wow, that was fun and easy. I'm interested in getting involved with more of the product. And so they would either send me a message or just read the docs or just start contributing on tickets, adding their opinion, their 2 cents. And I would encourage that because I was stressed and I wanted to help.
But do you feel like sometimes the need to contribute? I mean, you're not doing that anymore, I guess. I mean, not as much as we were doing that before. But do you feel like sometimes the need of adding something to Homebrew, or you just feel attached to it?
I do occasionally, but and I even started writing Homebrew 2 a couple of times, but I never get as far as I did before because I've done it. I'm one of those people that once I've done something, I don't want to do it again.
Yeah, sure. And what is also kind of special with this use case is that you kind of have 3 kinds of users or contributors. You have the end user that will just use Brew to install software, but then, and you obviously also have the core contributor, but in between you have this special kind of role that the guy will start proposing some packages that are quite simple to add, but even with that he will start starting to understand well the package manager and start entering the stuff. Is it helping a lot to get contributors, and do you think we can do stuff to ease this path in other products where you don't have this kind of intermediate role?
Yeah, Homebrew was special in that it was very easy to find that initial contribution that would help. Yeah. With a library use for an iOS project, for example, you might not see how to make a smaller contribution that help you get into it. So it's difficult, but it's up to the maintainer of the project to provide documentation and clear sources so that people who are interested can get into it. And if you've correctly identified the boundary where your project sits, so it doesn't do too much and it doesn't do too little. I see that a very common mistake with open source, where it does too much because the person writing it was excited. They're like, oh, I've made this great thing. Now I'll add bells and whistles all over the place. But that intimidates people who are trying to contribute. If you have a small modular framework, it's very easy for people to get involved.
I see. And do you think anyone can lead an open source project? Because it seems like it's a lot of work, handling the pressure, knowing how to say no to features. And
Well, I'd like to say anyone can, because I really never thought I could. But knowing when to say no and how to encourage people and get it all working is actually pretty tricky. So it depends on, like, if you really know the domain for your open source project, then you're probably in a good position to lead. And most projects won't require as much leadership as Homebrew did, for sure. Like,
because of its size, or if it's...
yeah, because the amount of contribution, like the video I played showing like just how insane it was for a long time. Only once I got other people involved in helping manage that influx of contribution did it become more manageable for myself. And most projects are not like Homebrew or Linux, for example, is another good example for me where there's a strong leadership, and there always has been a strong leadership. But I don't think all projects need to have that as strong a leader and as much of a personality as Linus is.
Is that a major thing that you would have done differently, seen prospectively?
Yeah, there is, but let me try and think.
The naming, like...
I might have chosen something that wasn't beer themed, like, because you know, it's fun though. That was, you know, like, people would check out the project and they'd be like, oh, it's got a fun beer theme. That's fun. There must be a sense of humor to this thing. I like that. But you have to be careful with that too. Like,
it's kind of a icebreaker, right?
So
it's kind of a icebreaker. Like, it breaks the ice. Like,
right.
It's easier to enter the project.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your talk and for being with us, guys. If you want to discuss with Max, don't hesitate during the breaks. Like, if you see him, jump and ask all the questions you want.
Yes, and also for those people tweeting with the hashtag FrenchKit, if you feel like, just also add to mention the speaker who's involved. So he might reply to the question directly in case we didn't ask the question ourselves. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.